All right, so now we're going to take a look at the organization of immune function and then take a look at some of the general cells that are part of the lymphatic system. And then we'll get into that a little bit more detail in the future here. So first of all, the immune system is a collection of barriers, cells, and soluble proteins that interact and communicate with each other. It's very complex, and it's to basically get things out of our body, right? Get things that shouldn't be in our body out of our body, whether by killing them or filtering them, getting rid of them, breaking them down. And we do that in three ways. So we have three temporal phases, three ways that we have an immune function, three ways we get rid of things that we don't want in our body. So the first are barrier defenses, such as the skin and the mucous membranes, so just getting it to where it doesn't get in to begin with. And you should have spoken about this when you were talking about the integumentary system specifically, how it doesn't allow things into the body. Secondly, we have our innate immune response, which is a variety of specialized cells and soluble factors, and we'll talk about that more in detail shortly. And then the third way is slower. So this second way, again, was rapid, and then this third way is slower but more specific and more effective, and it's the active immune response. This involves many cell types and soluble factors, but is primarily controlled by white blood cells, so our lymphocytes that we have already discussed in the blood chapter. So there are a variety of blood cells in the immune response. We're going to take a look at some phagocytic cells which ingest pathogens, our macrophages, our lymphocytes, which are specific and they coordinate activities in the adaptive immunity, and then cells containing our cytoplasmic granules, which help mediate immune responses against parasites and other intracellular pathogens, including viruses, so things that get into our cells. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at a couple of these, and then we'll get into more detail in the future chapter here. So this chart here, remember from our blood, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of these cells. The macrophage we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about T cells or T lymphocytes and B cells, as well as plasma cells, which are different, like a differentiated type of our B cell. And then we'll talk about our natural killer cells as well. So first we're going to go down to our lymphocyte section here and talk about these different types of cells very briefly, and then we'll get into more detail. So the first one that we're going to talk about are our B cells. Remember, our B cells mature in our red bone marrow, so that's why they're B cells. We see the B cells mature in the bone marrow. So they are made in the bone marrow, and then they mature in the bone marrow. The B cells are immune cells that function primarily by producing antibodies. So remember, an antibody is a group of proteins that bind specifically to a pathogen-associated molecule known as an antigen. So our B cells are going to be those that are making specific proteins that are called antibodies that are going to be pushed out into the bloodstream, into the lymphatic system, and float around and attach very specifically to antigens, which are the chemical structure on the surface of a pathogen. So that it's going to be floating around and it's going to attach to this antigen, and then it's going to go through a system of getting rid of that cell that it has now attached to because it's a pathogen. So it binds to a T or a B lymphocyte antigen receptor. So then we go through and then we're going to get rid of that pathogen, get rid of that cell that had the antigen on it, and we found that cell by floating around antibody. The antibody is kind of like a flag saying, here it is, I found this antigen, which is a bad guy, and let's get it. So once activated by binding to an antigen, the B cells will differentiate into cells that secrete a soluble form of their surface antibodies. So these activated B cells are known as plasma cells. Okay, so remember, we have our B cells and then our plasma cells. Our plasma cells are just differentiated B cells, that they are B cells that have been activated. The next type of cell is our T cell. Remember, the T cell is from the thymus. It actually originates in the bone marrow, where our other cells are made, or blood cells are made. Originates in the bone marrow, then travels to the thymus, and then matures in the thymus. It does not secrete antibodies, but it performs a variety of functions in the adaptive immune response. So they have the ability to secrete soluble factors that communicate with other cells. And then they also are part of the specific response or specific immunity. So just like the B cells are specific, the T cells are specific, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more in detail once we get more into the immune system. Then we'll go down here. We have our plasma cells, which we already briefly talked about. Another type of lymphocyte is our plasma cell, which is that B cell that has differentiated in response to the antigen binding. So when the antigen binds, our B cell differentiates into a plasma cell, and then it has the ability to secrete these soluble antibodies. So it basically, it connects to it, it differentiates, then it secretes more antibodies to then send out to attach to other pathogens. They differ in morphology from our standard B and T cells, and they contain a large amount of cytoplasm packed with protein synthesizing machinery. So our rough endoplasmic reticulum. So basically the function of the plasma cell is that once this undifferentiated B cell has found a pathogen, then it turns into a plasma cell. Then the plasma cell is going to use its protein synthesizing machinery to make lots more of these antibodies to send out and then find more pathogens. Then we have our natural killer cells, which, as its name implies, goes around killing things, not very specific. So it's the natural killer cell in the innate immune response. So remember, that's the second one. The innate immune response was more rapid. We have our natural killer cell, which is just going to go around killing things that don't look like self. So it contains toxic or cell-killing granules. It's going to basically shoot these cell-killing granules out of it and then kill other things that are not self. It shares this mechanism with our cytotoxic T cells of the adaptive immune response. And we're going to talk about the different types of T cells in a little bit. So natural killer cells are one of the body's first lines of defense. So that's why we saw that not in our barrier response, but in our innate immune response. And then we have the more detailed and longer lasting immune response, which is our adaptive immune response. So this is a summarization of those here. I do also want to add our macrophages. Our macrophages here, which are also part of our defense and our immune response, and they're going to phagocytize. Remember, they engulf, bring things into their cells, and then break them down. So they're going to phagocytize things like debris. They're going to phagocytize dead cells, bacteria, any other foreign material. They also are going to activate specific immune cells. So they actually alert the immune system to the presence of something foreign. So they can engulf something, bring it into the cell, and then in that process of engulfing it and bringing it into the cell, it can send out messages like, okay, I've brought this into the cell, it looks like this, and it'll send out messages saying, look for that same type of cell that I just found and I just killed. So that then these other cells can go out and can attack that same type of cell.